So I'm going to try to approach that from various perspectives and different technologies. And I know that this is a very hot topic. So it's not like, this isn't an evangelization talk or anything like that. It's kind of like a de-evangelization talk to get a more level-headed approach to things. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is inline styles, problems and benefits. And the second thing is obviously CSS, which I think most people are on board with. And then in addition to that, I'm going to add in JavaScript style sheets, also known as JSS, and go a little bit further than that for something that's a little bit more convenient for React. So you might be asking, like, why am I talking about this? Like, I just want to waste so many hundreds of people's time for 20, 30 minutes. That isn't actually the case. As I mentioned before, I would just like to kind of break a lot of stereotypes and ideas that people have about inline styles or using JavaScript as an effective styling solution, but also not going too far with that. So, and the name is obviously inspired by a book by Douglas Crockford. And
oh, I'm going to bring it closer to you because they can't hear you back there.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay. So sorry about the technical problems with that. So the book basically, JavaScript, the good parts, goes over why people tend to abuse JavaScript. And you get a lot of power and a lot of freedom, but you have a lot of responsibility, and you have to probably not use all of it. And you just look at how much of JavaScript there is versus how much of the good parts there are. It's kind of similar with styles. You just don't want to just go nuts with the Hello World app with the React documentation or something. So the first thing we'll talk about is inline styles in React. And so inline styles get a really bad rep, but they are pretty convenient. There's a lot of benefits to them that go a little bit under noticed. In case anybody's wondering, when I say like the people that are less familiar with React, inline styles are basically just HTML element style tags. So, and they are pretty prevalent in React. So inline styles, they're pretty convenient in a certain way that you can just create a style and just throw it in the same file. You might even throw it in the same scope. And so you don't want to do that. It's kind of like hacks, but it's good for that. So another thing is it's really good for distributing things in a modular way. Like if you get CSS, even if you're using Webpack, you still have to require it. It has to load in a separate file or something, and that's not really good for page rendering speed. Or you have to worry about putting it on the server and concatenating it together. So when you use inline styles, there's another benefit which is good for modules, and that's that inline styles always supersede CSS. So in terms of the style sheets. So you know what you're getting when you actually load up this, as long as the rest of your app looks okay. They're also dynamic, and they're dynamic in a certain sense. So when you get React, the whole basis is around props and state changing everything, right? So you get an update, especially if you're using pure components, which you should hopefully be using pure components, and if you're not, Google's good. But these dynamic props and state are pretty much the queue to render, and that goes really well with styling because you can figure out like, hey, how far do I want my width to be or my height for a certain element, and do I want to like actually do some kind of advanced calculation or something. You don't need to worry too much. And because of all these benefits, it's used by several respectable libraries and pretty widely used libraries. Like Material UI is a really nice, popular library that a lot of people have been using in production apps, and pre-beta 1.0, they've been using inline styles. And also Radium. Radium provides all the hooks for pseudo selectors and media queries and things like that. Things that you can do with simple objects out of the box with React. But with all that said, there's negatives to that. So they're potentially slow, especially in React. Like it's really easy to abuse them, especially if you're passing down objects and you're doing like object.assign with some sub component. You don't want to get too comfortable with just simply doing that, because that obviously causes your app to render just a little bit less efficiently. There's also unclear separation of style and layout. You look at like your DOM, and I'm going to go over this soon, but it just looks crazy, you know. And they're anonymous. They're not self-descriptive, so you can't see like, you know, when you have a class name, your class name says what it does. Hopefully, if you're giving it good names, you know. And I think we try to do that. So you don't get that benefit when you actually inspect the DOM. And you have to add a class name if you do want to do that. And then why would you actually use an inline style in the first place? You know, so all this testing and stuff. But so there's also a lot of boilerplate with inline styles. Like you're using something for convenience, but then you have to add like hooks if you want to add media queries or anything like that. And you're not actually using real, like, you'd actually have to assign the media query when you mount and unmount, and you'd have to assign the mouse bindings, and kind of takes away the convenience of it. So, and also just, as I said, all this adds up to just debugging is painful. And if you ever worked on a really large React app, you might notice that debugging inline styles can be pretty tedious, especially when you have like multi-level styles. So, as an example, you know, you look at a div, and this has display none, so it's a bad example, but you know, this is just one div, and you look at that in Chrome, and you're like, what the heck is this? And then you add one more div around that, and it's just like, you know, WTF. So this gets like really easily, if you have any kind of, you know, scalable app, it gets bad. And especially because you have to add all these hacks for like mobile browsers and stuff like that. You always have like transform instead of centering, and you know, it's really annoying. So I guess like with that said, right, like CSS must be the answer. Like everybody relies on CSS. It's just like that's a given. So yeah, I mean, let's talk about that. That's the logical next step, because that's what most people use for their styling solutions. And it's the best thing ever, right? It's just like, it's ultimate. It has no problems. Just absolutely no problems. So this is done with CSS. So. But there's benefits. So let's talk about why people think, you know, it's like the final solution. So, and there is a lot of merit to those arguments. It's fast. There are some caveats to, you know, that speed, which are underappreciated, which I'm going to go over in a little while. They're familiar. We've been using them for many years, you know, since the CSS3 spec, which it came before React and everything. So it should be no surprise. It's convenient for pure components, and what I mean by that is like when you actually want to have two class names. I'm sorry for the lack of slides here, but please follow along if you understand, like if you usually do these things. But when you use pure components basically update on props and state, and so you're combining class names, but with a simple space, and especially if you use ES6, you can combine them with a string literal or, you know, space or whatever. And since those actually are pooled, like all concatenated class names add up to the same strings, and then they match as equal, right? So then the render is cheap. It's just like immutability, so it's easy. And they use client-side caching, which is really underappreciated. It doesn't help the first time you load an SPA, but you know, it's a good benefit. But of course, like, you know, I just wanted to reuse that pro-con thing, and there are negative side effects to CSS, which we don't talk about when we're using it. So a lot of files, you know, can slow down your page speed. Like if anybody uses Google page speed rank or anything like that, you'll notice that, you know, you get a really low ranking, and that's because if you're on like a mobile device and you have like 10 CSS files for every single library, you have like, just the page loads slower. So there's obviously ways to fix that. Then on the other hand, if you have a lot of rules in your CSS sheet, there's something called the browser's critical rendering path, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And that actually ends up contributing to performance problems. And a lot of people don't realize that, and they import like really huge libraries, and you know, you have all that on your page at once, and actually not that fast. And then you have to create additional build processes, because the syntax is kind of a little bit, you know, basic. You're going to have to use like Sass or SCSS most of the time. If you're not insane, you should, basically, if you're using CSS for a large scalable application, not something basic. But and they're global, and you know, the reason we use React components is because it's components, they're modules, and even though we use composition, the idea is you don't want everything like in a global scope. Although Redux is, you know, pros and cons, but mostly you don't want global stuff. And you still need inline styles because you still need dynamic styles sometimes. You know, you might have a calculation or something and you have to kind of switch between, or you're using a library that relies on inline styles. So that is a problem. And I guess, like, you know, for developers, you can never just have win-win, right? You're always making like decisions, and I mean, it's always win-lose. It's like, are we always doomed to, you know, win-lose in life? You get to the Statue of Liberty and it's not there anymore. Yeah, I mean, yes, you always have win-lose. Actually, that was kind of a trick question. There's always a balance between picking technologies, and this is kind of what this is about. So it's not about like, yeah, you pick this one technology, you're gonna be like flying in space, you know. Maybe Tesla or I don't know, his other company, but I cheated. Okay, but it's possible for things to come together. You can put you can put CSS and JavaScript in one, you know, unique package, and they can work together, and you can use different technologies together, right? It can be a happy ending, and you know, people can, like, we're paid a lot of money because we have to figure out hard problems, and sometimes that involves compromising. So, yeah, a solution that I want to introduce to add to our tool set is JSS, and this stands for JavaScript style sheets, and JSS is not JavaScript style sheets. It's actually just an abstraction of CSS, and obviously the quality just suddenly went bad. But JavaScript, JSS is just an API to communicate with the CSSOM or CSOM. I'm not sure how to say it, so if someone wants to yell the right way if they invented it or something, you can say that. But yeah, so the CSOM is basically the tool that it holds all your objects. Like every style rule in your CSS page represents an object, and in like C++, whatever they implement the browser in. And the more you add to this object, the slower your page gets. And the reason is because I like to think of it like, imagine you're like, this is going to make partially no sense, but just like play along with it. Imagine you're the browser, right? And you want to play Where's Waldo, but like there's a horrible twist to it, like an M. Night Shyamalan type thing, right? And like, you want a very specific Waldo, but the CSOM is like a bunch of Waldos. You have to pick one from them, and every time you add a rule set, your Waldo parade gets bigger, right? You have to figure out, you know, more things you have to do before you pull out what style goes in which div. So actually, it happens on every render. It doesn't just happen one time. It's like a consistent, continuous thing. So don't always have like styles in your header sheet if you can. And I know that's like, how do you do that? If you load CSS files, all the style sheets load into the browser, right? And kind of, so that's what JSS helps with. Getting back to JSS, JSS pretty much is a really convenient JavaScript wrapper to attach and detach sheets easily to the CSOM. I'm going to talk about the syntax soon. I'm sorry, like I didn't go into like code, like a little bit lacking on slides, but. So it basically, it's just a wrapper to attach things to the CSOM, like attach new rules, new style rules, like you can, and when it actually builds styles, it actually caches the objects it builds. So it's not like some insane implementation. Like I read, like CSS in JavaScript is like taking a hammer for your favorite screwdriver, and this is not true. It's actually really well implemented, and it has a lot of other features as well. One of these great features, which when you add it with caching is amazing. So like when you saw that Waldo slide, like I actually have, this is a React Redux app, and I'm wrapping Impress.js, which is kind of old and it's not really well for React, but I didn't have that much time and I had to show something. So when the current step number is at like the browser playing Where's Waldo, the opacity comes in and it comes out, and like if you didn't have this this is actually the props. So there's a slide and it retrieves the current step number, which is like whatever that slide number was. And when that is equal to Where's Waldo, the opacity comes in. And when it's not, it goes out. And this is really convenient. You can do really intuitive things because React ideally updates based on props. And you know, like it's a one-directional thing. And so you just update your styles accordingly. And in the meantime, it's taking that step number, and it's actually like if the prop was filled in with like step number 50, it would actually like cache the result. So it takes all those aggregate props and it caches your calculations. And it also allows lots of things that don't really seem like they should be in JavaScript, like pseudo selectors and theming and plugins and tons of other stuff, which there's so much stuff I can't even get into, and I have like a lack of slides, so I don't want to put people to sleep. So, so yeah, there's an abstraction that helps us deal with that. It's called ReactJSS. It's actually created by the same guy that did Redux, Dan Abramov. So it's pretty intelligently designed. It's not because he did it, but just because it works well with React, which I'm going to explain in a second. So, the first thing I want to point out, it supports theming like right out of the box, and you can use like function values, and you get like a set of themes you can just change things with. Another thing is it has this thing called lazy evaluation. So the reason I brought up this CSOM earlier and went so in depth with the Waldo thing, because I want you to remember this, because ReactJSS, when a component mounts, a sheet is created and it's put into the browser's head sheet. Like it's put into the head tag. And it has the metadata, so you can actually see what component it is. And when your component unmounts, it automatically detaches itself. So what does that do? That actually helps us to traverse the DOM a lot faster when you render. So it's pretty great. And that's exactly what I just said. So yeah, another thing is the style sheet gets shared between all of the elements in that same style sheet. So you don't have like redundant copies of things, and even though you're using the same component, if you have another component with different props, but it has like the same props in certain instances, it'll fetch for the same cache source. So it's actually very beautiful. And so yeah, I'm just going to go really quickly into the usage. I just wanted this to be a short talk, and hopefully I didn't already destroy that, I promise. So yeah, you import it just like any node module. You create a style object, and you can see the background is actually being assigned based on a function value. So if the color changes, the actual background of that button style will change. And if the font weight, so the font weight is just a regular literal and the margin is literal, so you don't have to calculate anything. This is like the same as CSS syntax, except there's no vendor prefixing, by the way, if you notice. So yeah, so this is a regular button class. It's very shorthand, but using stateless component. You can see that we're giving it the class based on the styles above. So it retrieves those rules into it, and the way that we actually give it those is we're provided inject sheet, which we imported earlier, and that just wraps the style and then creates the button with the styles. So then that would just update along with the props. So for an example, I have 3 buttons in this code that just came up on the screen, and they all have different colors, and I just passed them as a prop. And you can see in the styles, the background prop of the button changes. And when you look at that, you see 3 buttons, and they all have 3 styles, and these are all actually there. So it's exactly what you saw. And if we go to like the whole debugging aspect, right? And this is horrible. Don't like look at the rest of the slide, because I'm using like this Impress.js slide library. But just to show you guys, like when you're actually debugging, you use JavaScript styles, like JavaScript objects, but then you see that like the class names, and this is really small. I don't know if you guys can see. Sorry about that. So you can see like the class names actually have like intelligent like list items and stuff. And this is how I'm animating and doing everything. I'm like literally just using function values, and it's nice. So debugging is a lot better. So going back to this bonus round, this is the end. And the presentation was created using React, Redux, Impress.js, and ReactJSS. I didn't want to show you guys the entire API documentation, because that's what people write API documentation for. So if you want to see an example, you can go to my GitHub, and I created this talk there. Aside from the Impress.js part, the ReactJS part of JSS is very practical there. So in conclusion, all 3 of these can work very nicely. So, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't use global CSS styles, but when you use React components, they play very nicely with props and pure components, and state, and JSS just comes in, and you can actually do very dynamic content really fast. Like I created all these slides. This is terrible, but over this weekend. So I wouldn't have been able to code that from scratch like without JSS. And that's my presentation.